Welcome to Casual Politics, Jonathan Powell. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction. You've been Chief of Staff to Tony Blair for 10 years, from 1997 to 2007.
Nope, 13 and a half years. I started working for him in opposition.
In the opposition.
As soon as he became leader of the Labour Party, I came and joined him 1st of January 95, and then I was the last person out the door of 10 Downing Street in June 2007. The only person to survive the whole way through.
And last time that you were in government, it's almost 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So do you miss your time back in Downing Street?
Well, it's a funny thing, you know. I was told before I left being Chief of Staff, having done it for a very long time, 13 and a half years, that I'd have these terrible withdrawal symptoms. I even had people who'd been Chiefs of Staff elsewhere in the world come and see me and say I should go and see a psychiatrist because I'd have a collapse of identity when I left the job. I have to say my experience was the opposite. I remember waking up the next morning after we'd left Downing Street and there was a radio report on the news about a bomb in central London, and I was thinking, why has no one told me? Why am I not doing anything? And then I thought, it's not my responsibility, and it felt great. So actually getting out of it at the time felt great. It felt like a great load off my shoulders after so long. And then it was only later on that I started missing it and thinking how much better I'd be doing things than people do it nowadays.
And what has changed in terms of spinning, actually, special advisors in government? Is it still the same, or has it changed since last time that you were in government?
Well, actually, there are now more special advisors. If you remember, we were criticised at the time for having so many special advisors for politicising government, and David Cameron has substantially more. And I don't think that's a problem, him having more. I think really it makes sense. You want to have political people, party people in number 10, who then leave if the Prime Minister leaves. What is worse is if you have, as under Mrs Thatcher, the politicisation of civil servants in number 10, of people who are very closely identified with the Prime Minister. So my brother, Charles, who was working for Mrs Thatcher, became very closely identified with her, and Bernard Ingham, her press spokesman, both of them civil servants, became identified with her. I think it's much better if you have special advisors who are clearly political and they go when the leader goes.
So as you and Alistair Campbell, that's why that people, they haven't got a good image of spinning and soundbites. Do you agree with that?
Yes, people sort of object to spinning, but if you look at Jeremy Corbyn, people are now objecting to the lack of spinning. So, I mean, people never quite get it right. Obviously, if you're talking about the spin, then you fail because you're not communicating effectively. The spin has got in the way. So by definition, as soon as people talk about spin, you've lost the battle.
But why? Because some people, they say that they like Jeremy Corbyn because he's an ordinary chap. So why Tony Blair and Gordon Brown or those surrounding them, they were not ordinary people that could resonate with a huge majority of people?
Well, they were ordinary people, and of course Tony Blair won 3 election victories, 2 of them enormous landslides. So I think you'd have to say that he did resonate with people, and we'll see if Jeremy Corbyn resonates with people if he can win a majority of that size.
But his majority declined, unlike Mrs Thatcher, who increased her majority.
Well, actually, there's an interesting pattern. I mean, as a political student, you'll know that what happened with the Tories is that they came in with a good result. They went down in the middle really substantially, then they came back up again to win with a substantial majority. Under Mrs Thatcher, that's what happened 3 times. Under Tony Blair, what happened was we came in with a very large majority and it went down gradually over 3 years. It was a different thing. I don't quite know how to explain why that happens under Labour, and under the Tories you have this sort of dip and rise effect. I'm not quite sure why it's that way.
As you just said, Tony Blair won 3 general elections for his party, but why then he's not popular anymore with Labour supporters?
Well, firstly, I would challenge that question. The only opinion poll I've seen recently, which was about 3 months ago, showed Tony Blair as the 2nd or 3rd most popular ex-Prime Minister after Churchill, Thatcher and then him, and everyone else way down below. So I don't think you'd find with the general public, actually, that Tony Blair is unpopular, as he is, of course, with the Chatterati in the newspapers and elsewhere. In terms of Labour Party membership shifts very substantially every year. So the Labour Party under Ed Miliband was a very different party than the party under Tony Blair. And now, of course, with Jeremy Corbyn and the very large number of people joining, it's a very different party again. So I don't think it's surprising that people tend to join the party because of the leader. So different people joined the Labour Party when Tony Blair was leader, and then different people again have joined now Jeremy Corbyn is leader.
In the Labour election for leader, to appoint the leader, Liz Kendall, the only one who was considered as a Blairite candidate, she just won actually with less than 5% of the vote. So could you see any problem actually lying there or not?
Well, I mean, there's a traditional thing that happens in the Labour Party, which is that if it loses, it tends to, instead of saying, what I really want to do is get back to the centre and win, they tend to say, I want to tell you what we really think and we'll become a protest movement again. And so Ed Miliband, taking over from Gordon Brown, wanted to go further to the left. And I understand one of the things he now believes is if only he'd run further to the left than he had in the general election, he might have won. I think there's absolutely no evidence to that. The evidence is he lost because he was too far to the left and Cameron won because he was in the centre. So I think that there is a natural tendency in the Labour Party to want to go back to being a protest movement and move away from being a party in power, because a party in power requires lots of compromises and people would rather be very clear about what they think, very radical. The trouble with that is it tends not, in the British system, because we're first past the post, it tends not to win elections. And if it doesn't win elections, you can do nothing for the people that you want to represent. And eventually the Labour Party then, after 18 years in the case of Thatcher, comes back and tries to win again and goes for someone like Tony Blair. Maybe we'll have to wait another 18 years, I don't know, I hope not.
But do you think that Labour Party should move on from Blair Brown years, just like Tory did, and they won 2 general elections?
Yeah, although remember it took the Tories a bit of time to get over the Thatcher thing. So you had John Major, and then after that you had 3 disastrous leaders. You had William Hague, then you had Ian Duncan Smith, and then you had Michael Howard. None of them could have won an election. So you go through that cycle in the Tory party too. And the difference between the Tory party and the Labour Party is the Tory party is a machine made for winning elections. It has a very broad ideological spectrum, but it is a focused, organised unit, ruthless unit for gaining power. Labour Party is much more a protest movement that sometimes comes to the sense that it has to win power to replace the Tories, which is why if you look at the last century, it's basically been a century ruled by the Tory governments with little gaps of Labour government in between, but the majority trend was Tory because they are so good at organising and winning power, and Labour goes through these long spasms of wanting to be a protest movement rather than a party in power.
But why there are differences of view from the PLP and the Labour supporters? Why is that? Why is that?
Well, as I say, because the Labour Party supporters have changed. It's a different party now than it was 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And they are people who people who are now in the party, and the people particularly who joined it recently want a much more radical outcome, and they want to be a party of protest rather than a party winning power. And the MPs, of course, want to be in power. They don't want to just be opposition MPs. Being an opposition MP is miserable. They want to actually be in government, and they know they're not going to get there unless they run from the centre. So they're in the position of wanting power. The people who join the CLPs across the country are in a position of wanting to be protests.
But you said that Labour supporters have changed. What happened to those who voted for Blair in 3 general elections?
Well, the difference, remember, the voters and the party.
Yes.
They say the party has changed. The party members tend to reflect the leader, interestingly. So the Labour Party was changing leading up to Tony Blair becoming leader with John Smith and so on, changed substantially while Tony Blair was leader. He attracted different people, more centrist people. Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband attracted different people. So the membership changes. The people, the public, are still the same. And this is why I think it's a crazy notion to think that you can win by being more to the left. Maybe I'll be proved wrong. Maybe we'll be like Greece with Syriza, or Italy with the 5-star movement, or Spain with Podemos. But I'm not sure, because we have this first past the post system, we don't have a PR system, and I think it's very hard to win by being more left-wing. What you need to do in British politics to win historically, if you're a centre-left party, is get to the centre.
But more young people are getting involved in politics since Jeremy Corbyn has been elected. So why wasn't the case under Tony Blair's premiership?
Well, lots of young people did get involved in politics in Tony Blair's premiership, but the sort of historical continuity seems to be that young people don't vote in general elections, proportionately to older people. It is the older people, the pensioners and so on, who do vote. Younger people don't vote, and that's not unique to Britain. It's true of most countries across the world. I think it's very encouraging that Jeremy Corbyn has managed to engage a lot more young people in politics, but we're talking about very small numbers of people proportionate to the electorate as a whole. These are young activists. That's good, it gives the party enthusiasm, it gives it energy, but if it's going to be energy that takes it off further to the left, that will be as a protest movement, not as a party in government.
Actually, Jeremy Corbyn, before getting elected as Labour leader, Tony Blair criticised him and he urged Labour supporters to not vote for him. Do you think that was it a wise move to do?
I don't know. I don't know whether it made any difference.
Even John Prescott, his his deputy just criticised him, and he said that he was
Yeah,
wrong.
but John
to do
Prescott's
so.
been criticising Tony Blair for a long period of time, so I don't think that made any difference. I don't know, I mean, personally, if I'd been Tony, I wouldn't have made that intervention, but I can understand he felt he had to do everything he could to save the party from going off a cliff. I think that makes good sense, but it clearly didn't do the trick.
Tony Blair won 3 general elections. What did just overshadowed his legacy as Prime Minister?
Well, I think that it's a bit early or premature to be talking about legacies. I think history will actually be very kind to Tony Blair. What people tend to do is look at the reputation of previous leaders in a very myopic way. They look at the very short-term factors that have just happened. So Tony is seen all about Iraq, rather than people looking a little bit further back and saying, well, what about Kosovo, where he made a real difference? What about Sierra Leone? People look at the sort of the late years as he was declining and the battle with Gordon Brown, rather than the early years and the enthusiasm. So I think when people come to look at his prime ministership in the round, rather than looking just at the last few years, that will change. And you see that really with reputations of previous prime ministers and presidents. There are lots of ups and downs. So Jimmy Carter, who was a very unpopular president, is now an enormously popular ex-president. Ronald Reagan, who was a popular president, ended up as a very unpopular ex-president. So I think you see these ups and downs. Even John Major, who was sort of a rather disastrous prime minister, ended up with recently with a sort of uptick in his popularity as an ex-prime minister. So reputations go up and down. And I think when people look in 20 years' time at Tony Blair's legacy, they will be much kinder than people who comment on it now.
And Tony Blair, who was very popular as a politician in the 90s, and now has become very unpopular. So this is just a shift.
Well, again, as I say, the only poll we have to go on actually shows him as being the third most popular ex-prime minister after Churchill and Thatcher. So he's even more popular than Attlee, according to the opinion polls. So I don't think it's right to say he's unpopular with the public, but that certainly he gets a real drubbing in the press day after day after day. It's interesting, really, that the press are still so interested in Tony Blair, because they've lost interest, generally speaking, in John Major, they've lost interest in Gordon Brown, but they keep on about Tony Blair. It's an interesting sort of magnetism for the media he still has.
Because he became a millionaire after that, he quit.
Well, they were interested in him before he became a millionaire. And anyway, in fact, all previous prime ministers have in recent years become millionaires. John Major became a millionaire very quickly, working for Carlyle immediately after leaving government. Mrs. Thatcher became a millionaire. I don't know about Jim Callaghan, but so, you know, it's not unique to become a millionaire. Do you think David Cameron's going to go and work for minimum wage when he's Prime Minister? I doubt it.
And there were some people, they were saying, if you read Andrew Ramsey's book, there is we get a sense that there is a sense of we got an impression that there is a sense of self-confidence within Tony Blair's personality that after his second mandate. So do you think that, was it wrong that he became very self-confident of himself?
Well, no, when I write about this in my book about Machiavelli, I think there's something that happens once you've been in power for quite a long period of time. And so if you're being unkind, you'd call this hubris. So all prime ministers come in, they're a little bit diffident, they're not quite sure what they could do. If you think of Mrs. Thatcher in her early years, she was very timid in dealing with the Wets. She didn't really take the Wets on, she didn't sack them. It was after the Falklands that she began to have more confidence, and then in the end became something of a tyrant, and that led to her downfall. In the case of Tony Blair, yes, I mean, he says himself in his autobiography that he wasn't quite sure what to do with the machinery of government when he came in 97. Gradually he became more experienced, and you see it with politicians. I mean, I watched it where Tony would be needing lots of briefing about government in the first few years when he was doing Prime Minister's questions. Usually after sort of 8 years, he knew more than the civil servants did, because they'd all changed job and he'd stayed in the same job. So you do get that, and that's why I think we have effective term limits, even if we don't have constitutional term limits. It's difficult to stay in power in our country for 2 terms or for more than 10 years, and it's sensible to leave before they throw you out.
So with staying too much time in power, you get obsessed with power. So do you think that David Cameron is right to just serve 2 terms?
No, I totally agree. I think that all the criticism of him for making an announcement that he was going, even if he didn't really mean to, it may have been a mistake that he did it, but I think it was a sensible thing to do, because I think trying to cling on to power, or even to pretend you're going to cling on to power for your full period is a mistake. Actually, you'd be sensible to recognise that you're going to go. I mean, he's gone slightly early because he'll be going after this referendum on Europe. You'd have thought he'd want to go more towards the end of the term, but anyway, that's because you want to have the new Prime Minister be relatively fresh, like John Major was, because that gives you a better chance of winning the next election. But anyway, no, I think he made a sensible choice, because if you look at, for example, Bertie Ahern in Ireland, if he'd left after 10 years, he'd left as a hero. In fact, he was thrown out after 11 years. Thatcher stayed 11 years, got thrown out after, well, nearly 12 years, got thrown out in the end. People would be better if they went after 2 terms, rather than like, for example, Mr. Putin in Russia trying to stay on forever and ever.
You're talking about Mr. Putin. Do you think that Jeremy Corbyn, he said that he will never press on the button? Mm-hmm. Do you think was it a wise thing to say as Labour leader?
Well, it clearly was his view, and I'm not sure many people would have believed he would have pushed on the button, so I'm not quite as sort of surprised by it as other people say they are. But it does make a complete joke out of having a nuclear weapon. If you have a Prime Minister who says he's never going to use it, then clearly it's not a deterrent, then you might as well save the money. So it does undermine the debate in the party. He said he was going to have a debate in the party, a proper policy decision by the party whether or not it wanted to keep Trident. He's kind of sort of made that irrelevant by saying if he were Prime Minister he would never use it, so in which case of course he wouldn't spend the money on Trident. So I don't quite know where that leaves the debate in the party, but or indeed what would happen to Trident if he were to be Prime Minister. You obviously would scrap it in those circumstances. So the public will look at that, and I've noticed in the opinion polls that Trident has always been extremely popular.
But it's not the first time that the party has been divided on Trident in the 60s. Even Dennis Healey said that he would not push on the button, and now, because he passed away 2 days ago, we talk about him as the best Prime Minister that this country never had. So don't you think that the mainstream media, they're just making fuss over this issue?
No, I remember when I was in the Foreign Office years ago, we did an opinion poll on Trident. So we asked the question, do you think Trident should be continued? And we got like 75% saying yes. And then we did a question, do you think Britain should have a nuclear deterrent? Which is essentially the same question, and we got 90% saying yes. So, I mean, people are pretty attached to the idea of Britain having a nuclear deterrent. It is, regardless of what the media say, is a remarkably popular element of our policy. It's almost seen as a sort of bit of national pride, regardless of the sort of merits of having one or not having one. So I think a politician who says he's going to get rid of it, especially in the face of military opposition, is taking quite a risk.
You last year you wrote a book called Talking to Terrorists, and one of your best legacies in government was doing the agreement with Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. So do you think, how could we talk with ISIL? Mm-hmm. Is that easy?
Certainly not easy. But the argument I make is that if we look back over the last 2 decades, and actually further, we always, every time we meet a new group of terrorists, we say we will never talk to them, we're going to defeat them, destroy them. And generally speaking, if they have political support, we don't. We don't beat them, we don't destroy them, and we end up talking to them. And what I've argued is that let's try and learn some of the lessons from the past instead of restarting every time we meet a new group. Now, it is true that ISIS is particularly gruesome, particularly loathsome in the methods that they use. They try and kill many more people than the IRA or ETA or those other terrorist groups try to do. But in the end, if they have political support, and what I would say is that if they were able to take over the city of Mosul, with a population of 2 million, with less than 1,000 fighters, then one must assume there is at least some political support for them by comparison with the Maliki sectarian Shia government. So unless we address some of the issues behind the rise of ISIS, in particular this disgruntled Sunni population in the north of Iraq and the majority population in Syria. In the case of Iraq, feeling disgruntled with what Maliki and the Iranians have done from Baghdad, and in the case of Syria, feeling disgruntled with what Assad and the Alawites have done. Unless you address those political concerns, you're not going to solve the problem. So in my view, it would be sensible to open a secret channel to ISIL in the same way as we did to the IRA in the 1970s, and when you get to a stage where you can negotiate, which will only happen when both sides realise they can't win militarily, then you could start a conversation. Now, it may be that I'm wrong and that ISIL don't have political support. It may be that they will be defeated militarily, but if we look at history, it looks very unlikely, and therefore it would be better to be prepared because we would solve the problem more quickly and many fewer people would die. Regardless of whether I'm right or wrong on the issue of political support, it would be sensible to try and address this issue of Sunni disenfranchisement in Syria and Iraq. That would be, for me, an absolute no-brainer. That's something we should be doing now and don't seem to be doing.
What about the Gulf countries? Why are they not doing anything to combat ISIS?
Well, they are. I mean, they're bombing.
Saudi Arabia, they're not.
But that's because they've got a battle in Yemen on their hands. But the
Kuwait,
the Emiratis and Qataris are both bombing ISIL, so that's not right. They are fighting ISIL, and ISIL, of course, is more of a
They were
threat.
providing arms to ISIS.
They were not providing arms to ISIL. Some of their population were providing money to support ISIL, but they haven't provided weapons. They provided weapons to other groups of Islamic nature in Syria,
So how
but
can
not
you trust them?
Well, because we need to trust them, because as you say, they're the ones who have the greatest interest in stopping this. I mean, ISIL has already declared a series of governorates in Saudi Arabia, which do not reflect the existing governorates, and have nominated people to rule them. So they've made a very explicit threat to Saudi Arabia to bring it within the caliphate. So for Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, ISIL is a very big threat, and we do need their help in combating it, as well as, of course, Jordan and Iraq.
And do you think that David Cameron should call for another intervention in Syria?
Well, actually, I'm writing a book now on intervention. My next book is about liberal interventionism, when you should do it, when you shouldn't, and how you should do it right, trying to draw the lessons from Iraq, lessons from where we haven't done anything like Rwanda or failed to do anything like Bosnia, lessons from Kosovo, lessons from Syria, lessons from Libya. And we seem to get it wrong every time. We seem to learn the wrong lessons each time. You know, in the case of Libya, for example, we intervened from the air, but then we didn't help them rebuild the government, and they all complained that was a problem. And President Obama said last week in New York it was a big problem, and one of the things he most regretted was failing to do more in the case of Libya. So I don't think there's an easy answer on intervention. In the case of Syria, I think we've got two big problems. One is we don't have any boots on the ground, and I'm not suggesting necessarily Western boots on the ground, because I see no public support here or in America or anywhere else for boots on the ground. But nor do we have any other boots on the ground, because the Kurds will fight down to the edge of the Kurdish area and have done a very good job at fighting ISIS. The Shia militias are going to find it very hard to take over Sunni areas in northern Iraq, and if they do, as we saw in Tikrit, they will sort of destroy it, and it will be very hard to get the Sunnis to come back and live there. And in Syria, we've got no boots on the ground. The Free Syrian Army doesn't really exist anymore. You've got a number of Islamic groups like Nusra who are doing quite well, but we don't have feet on the ground. So I don't think sort of intervention Iraq style or Afghanistan style makes much sense. And now you've got Russian forces there, you can probably start a third world war, which would not be a good idea. On the other hand, there's a case for thinking about safe zones that people have talked about along the border where you could put people. And there's a case for going back to the issue of no-fly zones, although again very difficult with Russian aeroplanes there, but that might have been a way of stopping the barrel bombs, at least, if we had imposed a no-fly zone on Syrian helicopters and planes.
But if we send, as you propose, if we send troops on the ground and then Russian forces are still present there, so probably there will be a civil war in Syria, and then we just forget about fighting ISIS on the other side of.
But there is a civil war in Syria.
Yes, but with Russia, Britain, and Syria as well, free.
Well, the problem in
and
Syria,
probably France as well, because they want to take part in this.
The problem in Syria is we have two different enemies at the same time, and that makes life rather complicated. And of course, the Russians are trying this sort of rather glib approach that let's all unite against ISIL, along with the Syrian government. But the fact is, the Syrian government is hardly fighting against ISIL at all. It spends its effort fighting the other opposition forces because ISIL is too difficult for it. And there's almost a complicity between the Assad regime and ISIL, that Assad goes after the Free Syrian Army, for example, at the same time as ISIL does. ISIL fights the opposition rather than fighting the regime. So, and now we see the Russians bombing the legitimate opposition and not bombing ISIL. So, Assad is the enemy at the same time as ISIL is the enemy. And because we allowed Assad to get away with what he did, we helped to add flames to the ISIL problem. And you know, there's a lesson in that non-intervention has its consequences as well as intervention.
But do you think that we should have intervened back in 2013, but the public didn't have a good view of opinion about the wars that we started in Libya and Iraq, so that's why the government got defeated in parliament?
Yeah, well, we have this history of going from one extreme to the other. So we had Black Hawk Down in Somalia, and we pulled out, did nothing, and Rwanda happened. So I mean, you go from one extreme to the other, for doing nothing in Rwanda to doing too much in Iraq, and we never seem to get it right. And public support goes down after one incident and then isn't ready to intervene when they really should. I'm not suggesting, and I don't think, even if there had been public support, it would have been sensible to do an Iraq-style invasion of Syria. That would not have been a good idea. But I do think no-fly zones at the beginning might have been a sensible thing to do. If you had stopped the Syrian Air Force flying, if we'd done some of the things that we did in Libya to stop the regime being able to do the worst atrocities against civilians and against the opposition, you might have not had the ISIL suddenly filling that vacuum and taking over. You might have been able to spare a lot of humanitarian suffering, and you might have stopped this huge refugee flow towards, but it's easy to be wise in retrospect, although I did think that at the time as well. But I don't think a ground intervention would have made much sense, but some no-fly zone might have helped.
But leadership in times of war is very important. Lady Thatcher had it during Falklands War, Tony Blair during Kosovo, the war, and Balkans War. And so do you think that David Cameron actually, he lacked a bit of leadership to convince his own party to vote on this issue in Syria?
Well, you're right about the need to have a strong leader to fight a war. It's interesting because Tony Blair asked me to get Mrs. Thatcher in to see him, both when he did the first military intervention we did, which was bombing Iraq with Bill Clinton back in '98, and then again he saw her when he went into Kosovo in '99, because it's a very lonely position to be a prime minister sending in forces knowing that people will die, but believing it's the right thing to do. So there is a particular sort of steel required of a leader in those circumstances. Whether David Cameron has it or not, he's never been tested, so we don't know. I think he did make a mistake as a political leader in trying to get the support in Syria. He didn't prepare it properly. He tried to bounce it through, and it went wrong. But you know, as you said earlier, it's actually more about public opinion, where public opinion was post-Iraq and so on, than just his leadership. So I think it'd be a bit unfair to condemn him on that. We just don't know if he has that sort of leadership potential, and people never know until they're tested in a real war.
So two last questions, as I know that you're in a rush,
Yeah.
Mr. Powell. So the first one is that on the issue of Europe, do you think that it's wrong that the Labour Party, it's again divided on this issue and back in the 80s?
I don't think it's as simple as going back to the 80s. I mean, the world has moved on. The sort of people who are supporting Jeremy Corbyn weren't alive in the 1980s, so they don't know about it. I think it is true that by going back to the extreme left, we're trying out again a formula that was tried before and didn't succeed. Although we've gone further this time, and we've actually elected a leader who is, you know, this is not Michael Foot. Michael Foot was an intellectual giant, a person who had been mainstream Labour for a long period of time. This is quite a different thing. This is more like Syriza or in Greece or Podemos in Spain. We're trying an experiment. Whether that will work or not, I don't know. Interestingly, there hasn't been sort of a great split in the Labour Party, that the centre and right hasn't fought back against Jeremy Corbyn at all. They've actually been completely sort of saying he won a majority, give him a chance to succeed. And that's what will happen in the elections next year in Wales and Scotland, and will happen in subsequent local elections and so on. If he can win from that position, that will be a complete change in British politics. If he can't, it will be a reaffirmation of what we think we know, which is that the centre-left can only win from the centre and not from the left.
And if British people decide to leave the European Union, do you think that there will be a likelihood that Scotland asks for another independence, actually?
I think it's, I'm glad to say, quite unlikely the British people will vote to leave Europe. One of the great things...
But polls, as I know that you like polls, they're showing that they fall.
Of course, but polls, all polls tell you is where opinion was a few weeks ago. It doesn't tell you what happens when a campaign starts or when some leadership is demonstrated. What's interesting about polls on Europe is that anti-Europeanism, Euroscepticism, is very widespread in British public opinion, but very shallow. It's like water in a sort of baking tray. And if you move the baking tray this way, it moves very quickly from one direction to the other. When the referendum was first announced, 2 years ago now, what was interesting was in the week that followed that, opinion moved 5 points in favour of Europe after a number of prominent political figures have spoken out. Michael Heseltine, Tony Blair, Ken Clarke all spoke out, and opinion shifted very quickly. So my belief is that once you get into a campaign and people are really facing to the question of should we leave the EU, the answer will be no, we shouldn't leave the EU. In terms of the impact on Scotland, I think you're quite right. There are all sorts of consequences if we decide to leave the EU, many of them devastating for people in this country in terms of economics, but also politics and our influence in the world. But leaving those aside, if there was a vote for England or Britain to leave, you'd certainly face a Scottish referendum, and it'd be quite interesting what the impact on Northern Ireland would be too, because Northern Ireland would potentially find itself isolated between an Ireland that was a member of the EU and a Scotland that was a member of the EU but an England that wasn't. And they would find that very difficult. And one of the interesting things about even unionist opinion in Northern Ireland is it's always been strongly European. I remember Ian Paisley, the leader of the DUP, coming to see us in number 10 at one stage in the middle of the BSE row about cattle and about rules on cattle, and he came in and said, our people may be British but our cows are Irish, and so maybe economic interests will outweigh that. So amongst the many disastrous consequences from leaving the EU, which I hope won't happen, one would be a Scottish referendum and probably a vote for Scottish independence. The other might be a very different attitude in Northern Ireland.
And my last question, it seems that each party now they're facing a civil war within their party, and UK, Tories, Labour and Lib Dems as well. So, and then the two big parties, Labour and Tories, they just move into the extremes. Tories, they shift into the right, and then Labour, it actually is swiftly shifting to the left. So, what will happen, in your opinion, to the centre ground?
Yeah,
And
well, that's a very, very interesting question, because the obvious thing for the Tory party to have done, given that Labour shifted to the left, was to try and occupy that centre ground. That was, in fact, the newspapers the weekend are suggesting that rhetorically they plan to do that this week during their conference. But actually what they've done is they've done the opposite. They've gone to the right. That's partly, I think, because for the period of the coalition government with the Liberals, they weren't able to be as right-wing as they'd like to be. And so they really want to get that off their chest and go back to their real feelings. And now they're liberated from the Liberals, so that's happening. The second is that George Osborne wants to be leader of the Tory party, and the backbenchers are very suspicious of him. They're very nervous about someone he thinks is a compromiser, and things like living wage is suspect. And he knows that, and in order to become leader of the party, he has to tack more to the right. He can't look too centrist. And he is the political strategist of the government. So his personal interest in becoming leader has propelled him to occupying the right ground rather than the centre ground. But if the Tories had political sense about their long-term future, occupying the centre ground is what they would do, owning it so that the Labour Party couldn't come back. So far they haven't done that. The consequence of that, I think, will be, assuming the Labour Party stays on the left for the foreseeable future, is that the Lib Dems have a real opportunity. Now, the Lib Dems...
But they just left with 8 MPs in Parliament.
Yes, of course. No, the Lib Dems are very weak. They've got very weak leadership. It's very difficult for them to take advantage of this opportunity. On the other hand, there is a protest vote that is not going to go to Labour because it's too left. It's not going to go to the Tories because they're staying on the right. And if there's a vacuum, that vote will pile up there as a protest vote, almost regardless of the Lib Dems. In the past, people have voted Lib Dem or said in opinion polls they vote Lib Dem because it's a place to park their vote because they don't like either of the other two sides. It doesn't really matter who's leading the Lib Dems, it doesn't really matter what the Lib Dems stand for, and often the Lib Dems stand for two contradictory things to win votes in different places. So if nothing changes, the probability is the Lib Dems will, at least in opinion polls, not necessarily in elections, will pile up votes in the middle. But that means there is a lot of centre ground to be occupied. There are other ways in which that could be done.
We shall wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Not at all.